Tonight, we step into candlelit corridors where voices once rose, only to be pressed into silence. Pages burned, names erased, visions buried, yet their echoes still linger in stone, in ash, in prayer. These are the forgotten women of the Church, their secrets waiting to be heard once more. We begin in the middle of things, not in Rome at noon, but in a side chapel at night. The door is half open. The world is quiet. On a wooden bench lies a small box of papers. No display, no plaque, only names pressed flat by time. This is a sleep story, not a trial. We are not here to argue history word by word. We are here to listen, to drift through hidden archives, old convent halls, and small stone rooms where great things once happened in a whisper. We will meet women who saw visions, wrote books, tended the sick, and led with calm courage. Some were called saints, many were not. Most were edited out. You will hear of scribes who copied a woman's lines into a man's hand, of abbesses who ran schools, farms, and libraries, then lost their signatures under new seals, of midwives charged with magic when they were simply skilled, of visionaries told to be quiet after the crowd grew large. We will not speak in anger. We will speak with care. We will honor faith, and we will honor truth. The Church holds beauty, music, art, and light. It also holds a shadow, and in that shadow are stories the day forgot. Tonight, we rest with those stories. Each chapter is a single candle, one room, one voice. No shouting, no heavy claims. Only the clear sound of what was done, felt, seen, and then set aside. As you listen, breathe slow. If you feel a name rise, let it rise. If you feel a memory that is not yours, let it pass like a soft tide. This is not a fight. It is a vigil. The pages are ready. We will turn them together. The room was still, save for the faint hum of the wind pressing against the high windows. Inside the archive, light bent strangely, as though dust itself knew it was not meant to linger on these shelves. You step into the chamber, careful not to disturb the silence, and there near the back wall waits a drawer. It looks like any other, plain wood worn smooth by centuries of unnoticed touch. Yet it does not resist when pulled. It slides open easily, as though it had been waiting all along. Inside lies a thin packet tied with faded ribbon. The parchment edges curl like autumn leaves, fragile but unbroken. You touch the ribbon, and it parts. The first sheet trembles in your hand, a letter written in a woman's voice. The ink is uneven, perhaps scratched in haste or hidden by candlelight. She speaks of visions that came to her at night, images she dared to share with her sisters in the convent. A river of fire, a garden of light, a voice whispering that God does not withhold from women what he grants to men. Her words glow with certainty, yet the final lines cut short. A blot of ink, a torn margin, as if someone stopped mid-copy or chose to leave the page incomplete. Beneath, another note, this one in a firmer hand. The tone is different, stripped of her color, narrowed to one line. She imagined what was not hers to see. The letter trembles not because of age, but because of what it carries. Her name is absent. It has been scraped out so carefully the surface shines. Yet you can feel her presence. She is here in the pause between the lines. She is here in the boldness of even writing at all. As you read, you sense her life beyond the paper. A young woman standing in the chapel late at night, candle guttering low, heart racing with fear and awe. She is not seeking authority. She is not seeking to preach. She simply cannot keep silent about what she has seen. But the walls are listening, and the walls have ears. Her vision passes through one hand, then another, and with each passing, her voice thins until it disappears into footnotes. You realize that the drawer was never locked. It was only left closed, with the hope no one would look. But you have looked. You have read. The silence is broken. Her words, even fragmented, breathe once more in your mind. This first act is small, almost nothing. You open a drawer. You read a page. Yet in this simple action lies the beginning of remembering. A woman speaks again, not because history allowed her, but because you chose to listen. And as you close the drawer softly, you know this. What was erased was never truly gone. It only waited for hands willing to hold it, eyes willing to see it, hearts willing to keep it alive. The scriptorium is cold, even in memory. Stone walls keep the air heavy, damp with years of whispered words and scraped parchment. The long tables stretch out, each marked by lamps that once burned late into the night. Men copied lines of doctrine with steady rhythm, quills scratching across vellum, while women in adjoining rooms prepared ink, trimmed quills, and sometimes wrote in secret. What remains of their work is not in the center of the page. It is in the margins. Small figures carved delicately between borders, tiny notes written sideways, like threads woven into a garment's seam. A star drawn near a passage, a flower curling at the edge. To the trained eye, these marks mean more than decoration. They are voices subtle, careful, resistant. One manuscript tells a clear story. The text is a sermon copied in bold black ink, attributed to a well-known theologian. But the margins sing differently. In faint brown script, a hand, smaller, lighter, adds notes, explanations, questions, even gentle corrections. The main sermon speaks of obedience. The margin asks, "And what of the women who guide the children?" The sermon declares that silence is purity. The margin replies, "Silence can also be fear." The historian who first opened this volume did not notice the side notes. They seemed harmless, faint, almost invisible under the dominant black. But another reader, decades later, traced the handwriting and recognized something extraordinary. The same hand appears across several manuscripts, always in the margins, always in dialogue with the main text. It belonged not to a monk, but to a woman in the convent's adjoining school. She had no authority to write sermons, so she wrote beside them. Her voice slipped into the gaps, refusing to vanish entirely. How many others wrote this way? How many truths sit quiet at the edges, mistaken for ornament, ignored as trivial? The answer lies not in what was preserved in the grand statements of authority, but in the shadows where women made themselves known without permission. Imagine her there, hunched at the side table, waiting for the lamp oil to dim just enough to hide her hand. She does not need to rewrite the whole book. She only needs to add her breath where she can. Her words remain, hundreds of years later, though the church never recorded her name. In the dark of your own room, you picture those margins. They are like whispers around the edges of dreams. Not loud, not public, but steady. And sometimes, whispers are the most enduring sound of all. The weight of authority often arrives in wax. Red or black, pressed by rings or metal stamps, the seal declares what is official, what is allowed to last. When a parchment bears a seal, it enters the record of law. When it does not, it drifts like dust, subject to chance, easily burned, easily lost. One small bundle tells this story with painful clarity. The pages are stitched together at the corner, filled with hymns written in a flowing hand. They sing of light, compassion, and justice. The melodies, though we have no notes, are said to have been taught in a convent where women led choirs that carried their music through stone halls at dawn. These hymns lifted weary villagers, comforted the sick, and marked holy days with voices pure as bells. But the packet bears no seal. It was copied, cherished, passed hand to hand, but never granted the stamp of approval. Years later, the songs appeared again, this time in another collection, now under a man's name. His seal is intact, the wax pressed firm, the impression sharp. He is remembered as the composer. The women are remembered, if at all, only as singers. The silence of the missing seal speaks loudly. It tells us what mattered was not the words themselves, but whose hand was seen holding them. The hymns did not change. The faith did not shift. Only the credit was redirected, and with it, the authority. Picture the abbess of that convent. She holds the manuscript, waiting at the gate for a messenger who never comes. Perhaps she sent requests. Perhaps she prayed. But the seal never arrived. Her voice and the voices of her sisters remained in shadow, while the ink of their melodies was carried elsewhere, given new names. The power of a seal is not in the wax, but in what it chooses to bless. One bundle is official, another is forgotten, yet the song itself still lingers, humming faintly in the walls, waiting for ears willing to hear. Tonight, you listen. You hear not only the music but also the silence that tried to contain it. You hear the absence as much as the sound. And in hearing both, you begin to restore what the seal denied. The parchment looks ordinary at first glance. Another ecclesiastical record, another tidy list of property rights and holdings. Yet, the longer your eyes travel across the page, the more it reveals its strangeness. The scribe has drawn a map, but it is not the map you expect. No clear roads stretch across it, no wide rivers marked with bold strokes, no towns carefully plotted. Instead, the margins shimmer with symbols. Small shapes that resemble gardens, dots scattered like seeds. Faint circles suggesting wells. You realize that the hand which made these marks was not concerned with trade routes or noble boundaries. This was a woman's record, a map drawn from daily life, marking where food could be found, where water was stored, where herbs grew wild. The archivists who first catalogued it placed it under miscellaneous household accounts. The category itself is a dismissal, a way of saying, this is not history, only domestic detail. Yet when you linger, you see something else. This is not mere household trivia. This is survival written down. A woman once traced these shapes with care. Perhaps a prioress in charge of provisioning a convent, or a laywoman trusted with managing supplies for an entire village. Her strokes are confident, steady, not the idle doodles of someone passing time. She had knowledge to share, knowledge as valuable as any treaty. The fields she drew fed mouths. The wells she circled saved lives. And yet, because she drew without roads, her work was dismissed as incomplete. Think of her by lamplight, spreading the parchment across a rough wooden table. She dips her quill, not to impress the bishops, but to remind her sisters where the best herbs for fever grow after rain, or which path through the forest leads to clean water in drought. Her map is not abstract. It is embodied, rooted in need and care. Where men drew lines of ownership, she drew places of nourishment. Later, another scribe reuses the parchment, scraping some of her lines until they fade, adding notes about rents and obligations. Her circles remain faint beneath his writing, ghostly marks visible when the page is held to the light. You see the tension pressed into the fibers of the skin, one hand layering over another, one voice buried under ink, but not gone. In the library, her map is filed away, judged too practical, too ordinary. But in truth, it is extraordinary. It is a witness to how women shaped the land through memory and care, weaving geography with survival. Though the roads are missing, the meaning is clear. Her world was not defined by power, but by sustenance. She charted not kingdoms, but continuance. You close your eyes and imagine walking her map. The wells, the gardens, the places marked with simple circles, they all hum with the life she preserved. Roads may be absent, but her path is unmistakable. A cartography of compassion, drawn in ink, hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to read again. The library smells of smoke, not the acrid scent of destruction, but the softer perfume of wax, lingering where candles once burned low. Along the shelves sit volumes with faint marks at their edges, small dark smudges where wax dripped and hardened before being scraped away. To most, these are accidents, blemishes, but to the careful reader, they are signs. They form a kind of index, an unintentional record of which passages once mattered most. A historian once noticed the pattern. Certain pages bore more stains than others, as though candles had been set beside them repeatedly, marking places where someone returned again and again. When the notes were cross-checked, a revelation emerged. The stained passages often contained prayers or meditations attributed to unnamed writers. Their tone, softer, more personal, hinted at women's voices. They spoke of care for the sick, the rhythms of washing and cooking, the holiness of daily tasks. These were not the grand pronouncements of councils or the rhetoric of disputations. These were prayers born of lived labor, devotion forged in the heat of kitchens and the hush of dormitories. Why were these passages returned to so often? Because they spoke directly to the women who read by dim light, who risked breaking curfew to find a voice like their own. The wax marks are evidence of a secret curriculum, a way women taught each other through the quiet act of returning to the same words. Picture the scene. A novice, restless at night, slips into the library. She carries a stub of candle, its wick bent low. She finds the page her older sister once whispered to her about. A page marked by drips hardened long before. She props the candle close, reads in silence, copies a line onto a scrap to carry back to her bed. Each time the candle tips, it leaves another dark spot. Centuries later, those stains are all that remain of her hidden study. The candle index is not official. It was never written into catalogs, never formalized in inventories. Yet it exists as the truest record of devotion, what women chose to read when they were free to choose. In those small burns, you hear their longing for words that named their lives, for prayers that recognized their hands as holy, their labor as liturgy. One parchment in particular bears heavy marks around a meditation on Christ washing the feet of his disciples. The prayer speaks not of power but of service, of bending low, of finding grace in the most ordinary acts. Was it written by a woman? We cannot prove it, but we can see who cherished it. The wax tells us everything. It points like a finger, saying, "Here, this is where we saw ourselves. This is what we could not let go of." As you sit in the library's quiet now, the candle index feels alive. Each drip is a heartbeat, each smudge a whisper. Together they form a map, not of roads, not of holdings, but of devotion. Women's voices may have been silenced in ink, but in wax they still speak. The convent's bell tower stands tall, weathered by centuries, its stones darkened by rain. Bells mark time, call prayer, announce feast and fast. They are the voice of the institution, heard across fields and villages. But once, long ago, there was a night when the bell would not ring. The story survives only in fragments, scattered across depositions and half-remembered chronicles. A woman was ordered to confess what she had not done. The charge is unclear, perhaps a vision, perhaps a teaching, perhaps simply speaking too boldly in a chapter meeting. Whatever the accusation, she was pressed to kneel, to admit, to bow her head in silence and assent. She refused. The record claims the bell rope was pulled at dawn, but no sound came. Again and again the sacristan tried, yet the bell remained still, as though held by invisible hands. Villagers gathered, puzzled, uneasy. Some whispered that it was a sign, a protest written not in ink, but in silence itself. The abbess was questioned, the sisters warned. Eventually the bell rang again, but the memory of that hushed morning spread far beyond the cloister walls. Her name does not appear in the surviving documents. She is referred to only as the sister, as if reducing her to anonymity could erase her defiance. But the silence of the bell testifies louder than any confession. It tells us that there are moments when refusal is itself a proclamation, when holding to truth creates a pause that cannot be ignored. Imagine her in the chapter room, her voice steady though surrounded by authority. She knows the cost. Transfer, censure, exile, these could all follow. Yet she refuses the lie. That refusal travels up the tower, through rope and wheel, until even bronze will not sound. In sleep, you can almost hear it. The hush after the rope is pulled, the expectant pause that never resolves into chime. That silence still echoes, a space carved out of obedience where truth could breathe. The bell would not ring, but her courage rang louder. It still rings now, in the stillness of your listening, reminding you that silence can hold power when wielded with unshaken heart. The famine did not arrive in one sweep. It crept, quiet at first. A late frost, a harvest that yielded less grain than the year before, a steady line of families appearing at the convent gate. Hunger grows in silence, in the hollow between ribs, in the way children stop laughing first, then speaking. By the time the bishop's messenger arrived with decrees about rationing and patience, the damage was already written in every thin face in the village. It was a woman who acted. Her name, as so often, is gone. The records call her only the sister who oversaw the bakehouse. That is the phrase buried in a margin, as though flour and fire were trivial things. Yet the bakehouse was the center of survival. She knew the rhythm of kneading, the timing of coals, the balance of yeast when grain was scarce. She also knew the measure of a loaf, how to stretch without starving, how to share without losing all. When the famine worsened, she devised a rota. Families received bread not in full loaves but in carefully measured portions, delivered in baskets by novices who slipped quietly down lanes at dusk. Each bundle carried more than bread. It carried the assurance that someone remembered them, that they were not left to starve unseen. And the loaves lasted. Not because of miracle thunder, but because of method. She mixed ground beans into flour. She soaked grains until they swelled. She watched ovens with an attention born of both science and prayer. Later, a priest in the town records wrote that provision was made through the grace of God and the wisdom of clerical oversight. His name appears bold. Hers does not. Yet, in the convent ledgers, if you read carefully, there is a column marked Extra Loaves, Famine Year. The handwriting shifts. It is hers slanted, firm, decisive. Without that line, families would have vanished from those pages forever. Think of her there, hands covered in flour, face lit by the oven glow, body aching from lifting sacks too heavy for her frame. She does not complain. She does not boast. She moves with the surety of one who knows that survival depends on repetition, not drama. Each dawn she begins again. Each dusk she counts what remains. Between those hours, she does the most sacred work of all. She keeps others alive. The famine passed. Harvests returned. Villagers went on with life. The chronicles celebrate the bishop who led through lean times. But the bread, the actual bread that filled mouths and kept children breathing, that was hers. And though her name was never carved into stone, her fingerprints remain on the ledgers, on the ovens, and on the very bones of those who lived to tell the tale. When you breathe tonight, let it be slow. Imagine the scent of bread, warm and simple. Remember the sister who baked through famine, who saved by portioning, who wrote not with ink, but with nourishment. History called her a helper. In truth, she was the architect of survival. The sky burned one evening, and all who saw it remembered. A streak of fire cut across the heavens, brighter than the moon, its tail scattering sparks. Villagers trembled, wondering if it was judgment or omen. Priests preached of sin and wrath, filling sermons with warnings. But in the convent garden, one woman lifted her eyes differently. She had long been fascinated with the stars. When others closed their shutters at night, she stayed awake, charting movements with charcoal on scraps of parchment. She counted intervals between appearances, traced shapes invisible to others, noticed how tides rose and fell with lunar shifts. Her sisters laughed at her long vigils, calling them odd, but they trusted her when planting season came. She could say, with uncanny precision, when frost would end or rain might return. They believed not in astronomy, but in her devotion, and so her charts quietly guided their labor. On the night of the comet, she did not shrink in fear. She ran to her papers. She drew the arc as it passed, hands shaking not with dread but with wonder. To her, the fire in the sky was not punishment but pattern, a signal written large across the heavens, waiting to be read. She wrote by candlelight until dawn, filling page after page with sketches, noting angles, estimating cycles. Her mind reached forward, imagining when it would return. What children unborn might see the same fire long after her death. Years later, her notes were copied by a man. His name remains attached to predictions, his work preserved in collections. Her originals were dismissed as curious household writings. Yet a faint annotation in one preserved volume matches her hand exactly. She is there, hiding in the margins once more, her knowledge unacknowledged but alive. The comet did return, centuries later, exactly when her calculations said it would. Scholars praise the foresight of the man who bore credit. But the truth is simpler, quieter. A nun with tired eyes, sitting by candle, drawing fire with charcoal, reading rhythms in the sky that others only feared. As you close your eyes, imagine her gaze fixed on that burning streak. Imagine her heart steady with awe, her lips whispering thanks, not curses. In her sight, the heavens were not weapons of wrath, but a language, vast and beautiful, waiting for any who dared to read. And perhaps, tonight, as you sleep, a star will press itself into your dream. Perhaps she is still watching, still charting, still whispering that the universe is larger, kinder, and more mysterious than fear ever allowed. The cell was small, bare stone, straw mat, wooden stool, a space meant for silence, perhaps even for punishment. Yet in its stillness, a woman began to write. She did not compose grand treatises or visionary tomes. Her words were simple, brief, almost fragile. but they carried weight far beyond the cell walls. Villagers came to her for counsel, though she rarely left the cloister. They slipped folded notes under the gate, questions about children, about sickness, about fear of war. She answered, one by one, writing on scraps of parchment or recycled margins of older texts. Her replies were never long. Care for the widow as you would your sister. The herb of fever grows near the stream. Pray with the psalms when words of your own will not come. Each line was short enough to memorize, yet full enough to guide. These letters traveled farther than anyone expected. A mother tucked one into her apron, reading it each morning until the paper wore thin. A shepherd copied one onto wood, carrying it as a charm against fear. A merchant, unable to read, had his daughter recite the words aloud until they became family prayers. The sister in the cell became a voice for people she never met, her advice woven into the rhythms of daily survival. When church officials inspected her writings, they dismissed them as familiar letters lacking in theological merit. They were not abstract enough, not lofty enough, not dressed in proper scholastic form. Yet their power was precisely in their simplicity. She spoke as one human to another, not as a distant authority. She named what mattered: care, healing, mercy, and people listened. Her letters do not all survive. Many were worn to shreds by use, lost to floods or fire. But a few remain in archives, tucked into bindings of larger works, recycled as scrap but preserved by accident. Reading them now, you hear her voice plain, direct, unadorned. It is not the voice of someone seeking power, but of someone offering presence, and that presence was enough to change lives. Imagine her alone in that stone cell, quills scratching against scrap, lamps sputtering low. Outside, villagers sleep uneasy. Inside, she writes, "Do not forget the hungry. What you share returns to you 100-fold." A simple line, a simple truth. It travels outward, through gates and hands and hearts, until it becomes something greater than she ever knew. The silence of her cell was never truly silent. It was filled with words carried on paper, on lips, in memory. Though the church ignored them, though history nearly erased them, they remain. And in reading, you join the chain. You become the next hand to carry her voice forward. Tonight, as you rest, remember this. Wisdom does not need thrones. It needs only a hand, a scrap, a word. Even from the smallest cell, truth travels, and once spoken, it never dies. The bell tower rises against the night sky like a sentinel, its stones darkened by centuries of wind and rain. Villagers know the sound well, how it cuts across valleys at dawn, how it tolls for weddings and funerals, how it calls them to feast or penance. The bell is the voice of the church, but one morning long ago, when hands pulled the rope with the usual rhythm, the voice refused to sound. The record survives in fragments, depositions from frightened sacristans, a brief note in the bishop's ledger, a vague mention in a villager's diary. They all tell the same story. The rope was pulled, the wheel turned, but the bell did not move. Again and again, the sacristan tugged, sweating, whispering prayers, trying to force sound into the air. But the iron tongue hung still, heavy as silence itself. The village awoke to a hush where sound should have been. Some thought the metal had cracked. Others whispered it was a sign. In the convent chapter house, at that same hour, a woman knelt before her superiors. She was ordered to confess something she had not done. The accusation remains unclear. Perhaps it was a vision she shared. Perhaps a line she wrote. Perhaps simply the courage of her voice when asked to remain quiet. But the order was plain. Admit guilt, bow, repent. She did not. Her refusal is preserved not in her words, but in the silence outside. As she said no, the bell said nothing. As she resisted, the tower echoed her defiance. For hours, the village waited. Farmers paused before fields, unsure whether to begin their work. Mothers hushed their children, sensing unease in the air. They all knew that bells marked order, and without the bell, time itself seemed to hesitate. Later that day, the bell rang again. It sounded ordinary, as though nothing had ever been wrong. Yet the silence of that morning was never forgotten. It became a story whispered in kitchens and fields, that the bell itself had sided with a woman's truth, refusing to proclaim her guilt. The documents do not name her. They say only the sister. but the silence is her monument. She spoke by refusing, and the bronze above her spoke in kind. Imagine her there, in the chapter house, back straight, voice calm. She is surrounded by authority, yet she carries something deeper, an inner certainty stronger than decree. When told to yield, she does not. When told to lie, she stays silent. That silence rises like incense, carrying her truth beyond stone walls, up into the tower, where even the bell itself refuses to strike. Her story is not written in ink. It is written in absence, in the sound that never came. And tonight, as you lie in quiet, you can feel it still. A hush, charged with meaning. A silence that holds more power than the loudest voice. The bell that would not ring has never stopped echoing. Change often arrives not in thunder, but in parchment. A decree copied in neat Latin, a new rule folded into an old book, a seal pressed onto wax. To those far away, it looks simple. An adjustment, a clarification, a refinement of order. But to the women inside convent walls, such changes reshaped entire worlds. There was a time when abbesses held real authority. They signed contracts, ran schools, managed farms, even advised rulers. Their names appear boldly in early charters. But then came the rules, not all at once, but little by little. A clause inserted here, with oversight from the local bishop. A new line there, all correspondence must pass through the confessor. Soon, what had once been freedom narrowed into permission, and permission into dependence. The documents remain dry, bureaucratic. Yet, if you read closely, you hear the sound of loss. In one charter, an abbess signs her name with firm strokes, commanding the resources of her community. Just a few years later, another version of the same document appears, but now the space for the abbess's signature is gone. Instead, a priest's name sits there, declaring that he oversees all. The abbess's authority is reduced to a line of witness, her power folded away under layers of obedience. In convent archives, you find the traces of resistance. Notes written in margins, "We manage thus for generations." A petition tucked between pages, begging that their right to choose their own leader not be taken away. These words did not stop the tide. But they show that the women saw what was happening. They knew the rules were changing, and with them, the story of their lives. Imagine an abbess standing in the chapter room, parchment in hand. Her sisters look to her, waiting. She reads the new decree aloud, her voice steady though her heart burns. She knows what it means. Her decisions, once her own, must now be approved. The convent's accounts, once in her careful order, will now pass to someone else. She does not weep. She does not rage. She folds the parchment and continues her work. Bread must still be baked. Children must still be taught. But in her silence, she carries the weight of all that was lost. The rules were written to seem inevitable, as though order had always been this way. But the traces tell another story. Women once led with freedom, and when rules changed, they remembered. Their memory lingers in faint ink, in petitions that never reached Rome, in the ache between lines of obedience. As you listen tonight, breathe in the quiet of their endurance. They did not disappear. They adjusted, endured, and carried forward what power they could. Their voices may have been pressed into silence, but beneath the rules, they still hum. If you lean close enough, you can hear them still, waiting in the margins for someone to remember. The sound of women singing once filled stone halls at dawn. Voices rose clear and bright, weaving hymns that carried across fields. Music was part of their daily rhythm, as natural as breathing. The choir was not a performance. It was prayer given shape and sound. Yet over time, their choirs were closed, their songs assigned to men, their music stripped of names. Manuscripts tell the story. Early collections of hymns sometimes bear women's hands, careful, flowing, precise. These pages hold songs of astonishing beauty, simple enough to be sung by many, yet layered with harmonies that reveal deep understanding of sound. But as rules tightened, as choirs were restricted to clerics, these women's compositions began to vanish. Their hymns survived, but their names did not. Pages copied later attribute the songs to anonymous, or more often, to men who collected them. One volume bears the faint trace of erasure. A woman's name was written at the bottom of a hymn, perhaps a signature, perhaps a note of authorship. Later, a darker hand scraped it away and wrote, "Frater Thomas." The hymn itself did not change. The melody carried on. But her name was swallowed by another's. Imagine the choir before its closure. Rows of women in white habits, candles flickering as voices blend. They sing not for recognition, not for applause, but because singing is how they breathe prayer into the world. Each note is a thread connecting heaven to earth. Each harmony is a reminder that beauty belongs to all. Then, slowly, silence falls. The choir is deemed improper. Women's voices are called distraction. The songs continue, but sung by others, credited to others, while their own throats are stilled. Yet, music has memory. It lingers in stone, in arches that once vibrated with sound. Even now, when you walk through those chapels, you can feel it. The air remembers. The walls remember. Their songs may have been reassigned, but they were never erased. Tonight, let your breath be steady. Hear in the quiet the echo of those choirs. Their hymns rise again in your imagination, no longer anonymous, no longer silenced. The closed choirs still sing softly, insistently, waiting for ears that will finally hear their true voices. The parchment is heavy, its surface scraped and smoothed again and again. It holds a woman's vision, at least, what remains of it. Beneath the words lies a faint underlayer, erased but not fully gone. If you tilt the sheet toward the light, you see the ghost of her hand, lines written in softer ink, hesitant but sincere. Over it, a stronger hand has layered corrections. These are the marks of her confessor. She was told to write what she saw, and she obeyed. Her visions came in the chapel at dawn. In the quiet before the bell rang, she wrote of a figure in light, of rivers flowing through stone, of a voice telling her that compassion was greater than command. Her words moved quickly, spilling from her as though she feared losing them if she paused. But when the pages reached the confessor, his task was to clarify. Clarification meant cutting. Where she wrote of rivers, he changed them to streams of doctrine. Where she wrote of compassion, he inserted obedience. He polished her wild imagery into neat allegory, reshaping her voice until it mirrored his theology. In some passages, whole sentences are crossed out, with notes like too vague or not suitable for women. Her visions, once vibrant, become tame under his pen. And yet, if you read slowly, you hear her still. In the faintest ink at the margins, she slips through. A phrase that does not match his style. A metaphor too tender, too raw, to have come from him. It is as though she spoke in code, hiding her truth in the folds of his corrections. She knew he would cut, so she buried her voice where she could, trusting that someone, someday, might see it. Imagine her at the desk, quill in hand, heart racing as she chooses her words. She knows the danger. If her visions stray too far from doctrine, she risks censure. If she writes nothing, she betrays the voice she hears. So she writes, carefully, with both honesty and caution. She hopes the confessor will preserve her meaning, but she knows better. His task is not to preserve, but to control. He signs the pages, his name large at the bottom. Hers does not appear. When the visions are copied into collections, they are cited as teachings guided by Father. Her hand vanishes into his authority, yet the parchment itself refuses full obedience. Scrapes leave scars, ink seeps through. Ghost letters shimmer under light. The more you look, the more her presence grows. It is not gone. It is layered, hidden, but alive. The confessor may have redacted, but he could not erase her entirely. The page is a battlefield between two voices, and though his lines dominate, hers still hum beneath. Tonight, as you close your eyes, you may hear her whispers in the quiet. Not polished, not controlled, but free, wild, unfiltered. The voice of a woman who dared to write what she saw, knowing it would be covered, yet trusting that truth always finds a way to break through. When people imagine trials, they picture fire. Torches raised, angry crowds, accusations shouted in public squares. But not all trials of women in the church were loud. Many were quiet, almost invisible. No flames, no mobs, just silence, paperwork, and decisions made in closed rooms. These were the trials without torches, and they were just as devastating. A nun might be summoned to a small chamber. 3 men would sit behind a table, parchment before them. They would not shout. They would not strike. They would simply ask questions. Why did you write this? Why did you speak of visions? Why did you gather sisters in the garden without permission? The tone was calm, almost polite, but the weight was crushing, for each question carried an unspoken command. Confess, or lose everything. In these rooms, truth bent under pressure. Women confessed to things they had not done, simply to end the questioning. They admitted to improper zeal, to overstepping their station, to sharing thoughts without approval. None of these were crimes in the truest sense, but once written down, they became marks against them. Punishment did not come as flames. It came as transfer. A woman leading a thriving community was suddenly reassigned to a distant convent. Her sisters wept, but could not resist. Another was told she must never write again. Her quills taken, her desk cleared. Another was labeled fragile of mind and confined to her cell. These punishments left no dramatic scars, but they silenced voices just as effectively as fire. Records of these quiet trials fill archives. They are written in formal Latin, full of phrases like pro bono disciplinae for the good of discipline. But between the lines, you hear the women's grief, a petition for appeal, a plea to remain near her community, a note from her sisters, begging leniency. All denied. Imagine one of these women walking out of the chamber. The day outside is ordinary. Birds sing. Villagers pass by unaware. But for her, everything has changed. She will never again hold the role she cherished. She will never again speak freely. Her trial left no flames, no spectacle, but it burned her future all the same. The church recorded these as routine matters, nothing extraordinary, but each one represents a silencing. Each one erased a voice that might have carried wisdom, care, or vision into the world. These are the trials that history forgets, because they lack the drama of fire. But forgetting them is another silence layered on silence. Tonight, as you lie in darkness, remember that not all wounds are loud. Some are inflicted in whispers, in signatures on parchment, in orders carried out quietly. And yet, silence itself becomes a testimony. The absence of a woman's voice tells us she once spoke. The shadow of her trial reminds us that her words mattered enough to be feared. Exile does not always mean distant lands. Sometimes it means being sent across the same valley to another convent under the guise of peace. It was the common solution when a woman's voice grew too strong, when her influence unsettled the careful balance of control. She was not condemned, not burned, not even publicly shamed. She was simply moved. A gentle exile. The records are sparse but telling. Transferred for harmony. Relocated to preserve unity. Sent to another house for prudence. The words are mild, almost kind, yet behind them lies the pain of separation, the tearing away of a leader from her sisters. One abbess stands out. For 20 years, she led her community with wisdom. Under her guidance, the convent flourished. They taught children, tended the sick, managed fields with efficiency. Her sisters trusted her judgment, and the villagers respected her deeply. But success itself became her danger. Whispers reached the bishop that she held too much influence, that people listened to her more than to him. So one day, a letter arrived. She was to be transferred immediately. She did not resist. She packed her few belongings, a crucifix, a psalter, a scarf woven by one of her novices. Her sisters wept, clinging to her hands. She blessed each of them, her voice steady, though her heart ached. Then she walked out the gate, not in disgrace, but in quiet exile. At the new convent, she was given no authority. She lived as an ordinary sister, rising for prayer, working in silence. Yet even there, her presence carried weight. Younger nuns sought her counsel. Villagers recognized her wisdom. She could not be erased, only relocated. Gentle exile was meant to diminish, but in truth, it preserved. By removing her from her circle of influence, they thought to silence her. Instead, her wisdom spread wider, carried to new places, whispered in new ears. Her story, though hidden, traveled through the networks of women who remembered her with love. Imagine her walking into the new convent for the first time. She is older now, her steps slower, but her eyes are steady. She greets the sisters, kneels in prayer, and accepts her place without complaint. Yet inside, she knows the truth. Exile cannot erase what she has built. The memories of her leadership remain alive in those who lived under her care. The church wrote her down as transferred. That was the official word. But to those who knew her, she remained abbess in spirit, a leader even in silence. Tonight, as you rest, think of her. Think of the quiet dignity of exile, of how she carried herself with grace even as her authority was stripped away. Her story teaches that power is not only in titles, it is in presence, in memory, in the lasting imprint of care. Gentle exile could not erase her. And in remembering, you carry her home again. The convent's stairwell was narrow, stone worn smooth by countless feet. Dust gathered in its corners, where few bothered to look. But once, during a repair, a mason found a small chest tucked beneath the lowest step. Its wood was darkened by age, its hinges stiff with rust. Inside lay a bundle of parchment tied with cord. No seals marked it. No official hand had catalogued it. It was hidden deliberately, as though someone had placed it there to wait. When opened, the pages revealed sermons simple, direct, written not for bishops or scholars, but for daughters, sisters, mothers. The language was plain, the images drawn from fields and kitchens, rivers and bread. They spoke of God's presence in washing clothes, in grinding grain, in carrying water at dawn. They were not lofty theologies, but grounded words, speaking faith into the fabric of ordinary life. What startled the archivists was the voice. These were not homilies written by priests for women to hear. These were words written by women for each other. The hand that copied them was steady, firm, unashamed. One page began, "Sisters, know that your work is prayer. Know that your hands bear grace when they mend, when they sew, when they heal." Why had they been hidden? Perhaps because such sermons were never meant to exist. The official rule declared that women must listen, not preach. Yet here was evidence that they not only spoke but preserved their words for one another. Someone, perhaps fearing discovery, tucked them beneath the stair, hoping the chest would remain unseen until safer days. Imagine the women gathered in a dim room, candles flickering, listening as one of their own read from these texts. They nod, tears glisten, hearts lift not because the words are new, but because they speak their truth. They hear themselves named as holy, their labor called sacred, their voices recognized. It is a nourishment deeper than bread, a confirmation that God moves through them too. Centuries later, the chest is opened. The sermons breathe again, fragile yet resilient. Though their authors remain nameless, their words echo with clarity. Women once spoke boldly of God's presence in their daily lives, and those words were treasured enough to hide, guarded like a flame beneath the stairs. Tonight, as you listen, you can almost hear them whisper still. Words that were meant to vanish instead return, not with thunder, but with a gentle strength that outlives silence. There is a phrase that appears again and again in medieval sermons. As the holy teacher once said, the words that follow are often profound, rich metaphors of light and water, of birth and renewal. For centuries, these lines were credited to famous men, but careful study shows something curious. The earliest versions of these phrases appear in small convent manuscripts, written in women's hands. One metaphor tells of light borrowed like a candle passed from flame to flame. It speaks of God's grace moving from one soul to another, not diminished but multiplied. In later collections, this metaphor is attributed to a celebrated friar, repeated in pulpit after pulpit, its origin forgotten. But in a faded manuscript tucked in a convent library, the same words appear, signed not by him but by Sorer Anna. Her ink is faint, her Latin unpolished, but her voice is clear. She was the first to write the image. He only repeated it. This is not an isolated case. Again and again, phrases that became famous trace back to women's pens. Sometimes copied directly, sometimes softened, sometimes reshaped, but always lifted. Their metaphors traveled, their wisdom spread, but their names vanished. Why? Because authority decided that women's words could not stand alone. To preserve them, they were borrowed, given new names, reshaped until they seemed to belong elsewhere. The friars who quoted them may not have even realized they were taking from women. They read, they copied, they preached, never asking whose hand first lit the flame. Imagine Soror Anna in her cell, writing by lamplight. She tries to describe grace, fumbling for words until she sees her candle. She lifts it, lights another from it, and smiles as the flame doubles. Not weaker, but brighter. She writes, "So grace is shared, never lost, always multiplied. It is simple, true, luminous." She never imagines her phrase will travel across Europe, repeated for centuries, carrying someone else's name. But the words themselves are alive. They do not care whose lips speak them. They shine, carrying her vision forward. Even in borrowed form, her light spreads, and though history forgot her name, the truth remains. A woman lit that flame. As you rest tonight, picture a candle passed gently from hand to hand. Its flame never weakens. It burns because someone, long ago, saw grace in its glow and dared to write it down. In one archive, a set of manuscripts bears a strange mark. Across certain pages, the ink has bled outward, blurred as though water once washed over it. Scholars puzzled at first. Was it accident? Was it fire? Was it decay? But as they studied, they noticed a pattern. The blurred pages were always those written by women. It seemed deliberate. Someone, centuries ago, had tried to wash them out. Perhaps a censor dipped cloth into water, pressed it to the parchment, hoping to erase without burning. Perhaps they feared outright destruction would draw notice, so they chose this subtler way. The words remain, but faint, veiled behind stains. They are harder to read, but not gone. The ink resisted, clinging stubbornly to the fibers, refusing complete erasure. One blurred text tells of visions of Christ appearing not in cathedrals but in kitchens, among pots and baskets, speaking to women as they worked. Another speaks of divine love as a mother's embrace, tender and fierce. Both images troubled authorities, who preferred God clothed in power, not in intimacy. And so, perhaps, they tried to wash them away. Yet the bleeding ink became its own testimony. The smears look like shadows of tears, as though the page itself wept for what was lost. Reading them now requires patience, squinting, tracing faint strokes with care. But in the struggle, the reader feels the weight of resistance. These words were not meant to survive, yet they did. Imagine the woman who first wrote them. She dipped her quill, steady hand moving across the page, unaware of the attempt to erase her future. She trusted the ink, believing it would hold her truth. And though someone tried to silence her, the ink clung fast. Even blurred, even scarred, her words cross centuries to reach you. In a way, the bleeding makes them stronger. They are no longer just texts, they are witnesses, proof of both erasure and endurance. The smudges say, someone feared these words. Someone tried to remove them, and yet here they are, fragile but alive, speaking still. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think of that ink. Think of how it bled but did not vanish, how it carried a woman's voice through fire and water, through silence and centuries. In your listening, you restore her. In your remembering, her words live again. Every library carries its secrets, and convent libraries more than most. Their catalogs, those careful lists written in long columns of Latin, were meant to keep order, each book numbered, each shelf accounted for. Yet here and there, at the bottom of a page or tucked into a corner, one finds a peculiar entry. It is not a title. It is not even a word. It is a letter, followed by a mark. Sometimes Z, sometimes a cross, sometimes a simple dash. The catalogers called them miscellany, or left them blank. But the sisters knew. These were the books that did not fit, the books that belonged but could not be seen. On one brittle sheet of catalogs, the last column lists Psalter, Commentary on John, Book of Hours, then simply Z. No explanation. The volume marked Z survived, hidden behind heavier tomes. When pulled from the shelf, Its cover revealed no title, only worn leather. Inside were writings unlike any others in the collection, prayers written in women's voices, meditations on childbirth, on fear in the night, on the love between friends. They were not anonymous, but signed, timidly, by sisters whose names appear nowhere else in the archives. Z became a safe letter, a sign among the catalogers. Here is what does not belong. Here is what we cannot lose but cannot display. Over time, more Z entries appear in different libraries. Each time, the same patterned text that spoke of women's lives, women's labor, women's visions. The scribes who wrote them may not have been bold enough to declare them openly, but they left them there, tucked behind the veil of a letter that meant everything and nothing at once. Imagine a novice, given the task of updating the catalog. She writes line after line in neat script, then pauses at the volume she knows carries her abbess's secret writings. She hesitates, then places the letter Z. It is a gesture of protection, of resistance. She knows the book may not be safe in plain sight, but hidden in plain code, it might survive. She closes the catalog, heart steady, knowing she has done what she could. Centuries later, readers open these Z volumes. Their bindings are cracked, their words fragile, but they breathe again. Each line is a voice once thought too quiet, preserved by the courage of women who refused erasure. The catalogs tried to silence with letters, but the letters became shields. Tonight, think of Z. Think of all the voices tucked into that final letter, the place where the forgotten were kept safe. You may never know their names, but you hold their secret. Silence does not always mean loss. Sometimes it means survival. Between the pages of a psalter, pressed flat and brittle, lies a flower. Its petals are faded brown now, its stem fragile as ash. To the casual eye, it is nothing. But pressed flowers do not arrive by accident. Someone placed it there, carefully, deliberately, closing the book over it to preserve a moment, a memory. The Psalter belonged to a convent known for its discipline. Its rules were strict, its silence heavy. Yet here, in the middle of chants and prayers, rests this small rebellion of tenderness. Perhaps it was plucked by a sister walking the cloister garden at dusk when the evening bell rang. Perhaps it was placed there on the day of profession, a gift to remind her of the world beyond walls. Perhaps it marked a passage she read again and again. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. Whoever pressed it knew its meaning. For her, it was a sign that God's creation was not only in stone and ink, but in living color. A reminder that beauty grows quietly, even in small corners. Scholars often overlook pressed flowers, treating them as trifles. Yet they are powerful testimonies. They mark the presence of women who lived and breathed and cared enough to leave behind symbols of life. In archives, pressed flowers appear again and again, tucked into missals, psalters, even theological treatises. They are like fingerprints, soft imprints of existence that refuse to be erased. Imagine the sister holding this flower. She walks through the garden, hears bees hum, feels evening light fade on her face. She bends, picks the bloom, and carries it back with her. In the silence of her cell, she opens her psalter, finds the page she loves most, and lays the flower across it. She closes the book, whispering a prayer that the memory will remain. Centuries later, you open the same book. The flower crumbles at your touch, but its presence speaks louder than words. It tells you she lived, she prayed, she cherished beauty in the midst of discipline. Her pressed flower is her voice, soft but enduring. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine that flower. Imagine its color, once bright, now faded but not lost. Let it remind you that beauty, however small, leaves a mark. What is pressed into memory does not vanish. It remains, waiting for hands willing to find it. The famine year is recorded in official chronicles as a season of scarcity, with bishops urging prayer and patience. But in one small town, survival came not from sermons, but from the leadership of an abbess. Her convent sat at the town's edge, its lands fertile, its barns full. When hunger spread, villagers turned not to the bishop, but to her. She did what mayors do. She counted stores, rationed grain, organized deliveries. She kept lists of families most in need, ensured widows and children received first portions, and supervised planting schedules for the coming year. Her ledger, still preserved, reads like a civic record. 1 sack to the widow Marta, 2 loaves to the weaver's children, seeds to the farmer near the river to be returned at harvest. The bishop eventually protested, claiming her work interfered with proper order. He declared that aid should pass through clerical hands. But the villagers resisted. They trusted her, not because she spoke with authority from a pulpit, but because she acted with compassion and precision. Under her care, the town endured. When records were later compiled, her name appears faintly, mentioned only as the abbess. The bishop's name shines brighter, praised for overseeing charitable works. But the details betray the truth. It was her handwriting in the ledgers. It was her seal on the baskets. It was her planning that turned scarcity into survival. Imagine her walking the narrow streets, cloak pulled against the wind. Villagers gather at their doors, eyes hollow but hopeful. She greets each one by name, checks her lists, assures them bread is coming. She carries not wealth, not power, but presence. And in presence, she leads. When the famine ended, the bishop reclaimed credit. But the town remembered differently. They told stories of the abbess who ruled like a mayor, who knew every child, who kept the town alive with her lists and her care. The chronicles may not honor her, but memory does. Tonight, as you drift into rest, think of her steady steps, her careful records, her unwavering compassion. She was not called mayor. She was abbess. Yet in truth, she was both. And through her, we see how women led not by decree, but by the daily labor of love. The manuscript at first seems ordinary. Psalms flow in neat lines, Latin phrases marching one after another, copied with practiced steadiness. But in the margins, where most scribes drew simple flowers or curling vines, something else appears. Circles, triangles, spirals. Some overlap. Some nest inside one another. Some connect with lines drawn like threads between stars. They are not random. They are careful, deliberate, exact. These patterns belong to a nun who saw God not only in words but in shapes. To her, creation itself was geometry, harmony inscribed in stone and sky. Where others spoke of doctrine, she drew spirals to show growth, triangles to mark the balance of body, mind, and spirit. In one corner, a star inside a circle suggests infinity contained. In another, a series of squares folds into smaller and smaller ones, as though to remind the reader of eternity compressed into a single breath. Her drawings did not please her confessors. Geometry, to them, was the domain of scholars, men trained in universities. For a woman to fill the margins with such work seemed presumptuous, even dangerous. They told her to stop. She did not. Instead, she drew more quietly, smaller at first, then hidden between letters, then disguised as flowers. But always, the shapes returned. Imagine her sitting at the long wooden desk, candlelight flickering across vellum. The room hums with the scratch of other quills. She pauses, looks around, then slips her compass from her sleeve. Slowly, she sets a point, turns the arc, and completes a circle. The shape glows against the page, silent testimony that she sees what others do not. She does not argue with the men who call her visions frivolous. She does not need to. Her geometry speaks for her. Later, these margins were copied, the shapes included as decorative. Scholars studying them centuries later recognize the proportions ratios that echo the very structures of cathedrals. It is possible, they realize, that her shapes guided builders, that her vision shaped the stones under which thousands prayed. She was never credited. Her drawings were dismissed as ornaments, yet her hand remains, her geometry whispering still from the pages. The margins remind us that truth does not always shout. Sometimes it hides in circles and spirals, waiting for someone to look closely enough. Tonight, as you close your eyes, picture those shapes. Picture the sister who drew them in silence, knowing they were more than ornament. They were prayer and form, eternity traced in ink. The convent loom stood in the corner. Large, wooden, plain. At first glance, it was only a tool for weaving cloth habits, linens, blankets. But for the sisters, weaving was more than labor. It was meditation, prayer, sometimes even a secret record. For as they wove stories into the fabric. A surviving piece tells the tale. It looks simple. A strip of cloth, faded with time. But close inspection reveals tiny variations in the weave. Threads of different color introduced at deliberate intervals. A historian noticed the pattern one day and realized it was not random. The threads formed a code. Certain colors stood for names. Certain knots marked events. The cloth was not only fabric, it was memory. In this fragment, the names of sisters appear, not written in ink but in thread. A white line repeated 7 times marked one who prayed through nights. A red thread symbolized another, known for her care of the sick. A gap where the weave changes rhythm honored a sister who had died. This was their book of remembrance, woven in plain sight yet invisible to those who saw only cloth. Imagine them at work. The rhythmic thud of the shuttle, the soft tension of yarn pulled taut. The weaver glances at the pattern, not written, but remembered. Her sisters know the meaning of each thread. They sit nearby, spinning wool, whispering prayers, watching as their lives are recorded in color. They do not need parchment. They do not need permission. Their loom is their archive. The web of threads held more than names. It held defiance. When a new rule stripped the abyss of authority, a black thread was woven through the border, thin, sharp, a silent protest. When famine struck, the weavers added rough fibers from sacks, a memory of hardship. Their cloth carried the history others tried to erase. Centuries later, the fragment survives by chance, repurposed as binding for another book. Scholars peel back the layers, discover the woven code, and marvel. They call it folk art, but it is more. It is testimony. Women who could not write their history wove it instead. Each thread a line, each knot a word. Tonight, as you rest, imagine those threads. Imagine them passing from hand to hand, pulled tight, woven steady. Imagine the hum of voices, the weight of silence, the power of remembrance hidden in plain cloth. The loom was their pen, and with it, they wrote themselves into eternity. At the edge of one archive lies a thin book, hardly noticed among grander volumes. Its cover is plain, its spine nearly broken. Yet inside it carries something extraordinary. Memories rewritten. The text begins with sorrow. A sister writes of her childhood, of disappointments, of wounds carried from her family. She describes her father's absence, her mother's illness, the fear that shadowed her early years. Her words are raw, unguarded. But then, halfway through, the tone shifts. The same memories reappear, but changed. In this version, her father is kind, her mother strong. Her childhood filled with courage rather than fear. It is not denial, it is deliberate transformation. She explains her method in a few lines. What I could not bear, I give to God. What I rewrite, I redeem. For her, memory was not fixed stone. It was clay, malleable, able to be reshaped. She believed that by reimagining her past with compassion, she could free herself from its grip. She wrote her pain once, then rewrote it into blessing. The confessor who read the book dismissed it as sentimental exercise. He could not see its depth. But modern readers recognize what she practiced. A form of healing, a way of rewriting the story she lived, so it would no longer wound her. She was not lying to herself. She was creating space for freedom. Imagine her at the desk, tears falling as she writes the first version. Her hands tremble, her heart aches. Then she sets the page aside, breathes deeply, and begins again. She writes the same story, but this time, she imagines her father smiling, her mother laughing, herself growing strong through trial. She feels peace settle into her as the ink dries. Her rewritten memories become her prayer. Her book, thin and fragile, survives because it was tucked into the binding of a larger volume. Her words, though once dismissed, return now as wisdom. She teaches that memory is not prison. It is possibility. That even the past can be reshaped by love. Tonight, as you close your eyes, think of her. Think of the courage it took to face her wounds and the grace it took to rewrite them. Let her remind you that stories are not fixed. They can be healed, transformed, made new. The past may shape us, but with compassion, we shape it too. In a dusty archive in the north of France, a book lay unopened for generations. Its cover bore no decoration, only plain leather darkened by time. Catalogers had marked it as an account book, a convent ledger, and placed it on a low shelf among other records of wheat and rent. For centuries, no one thought it worth attention, but when a scholar opened it at last, expecting lists of debts and payments, she found something else entirely. The first pages did contain numbers, tallies of bread baked, wine stored, repairs ordered, but halfway through the handwriting changed. The lines of neat arithmetic gave way to something unexpected, a list of thanks. One after another, in steady hand, the abbess wrote entries that began with the same words I give thanks for. The ink records, not numbers, but blessings. I give thanks for Sister Beatrice's song at dawn. I give thanks for the rain that softened the earth. I give thanks for the child healed of fever. I give thanks for bread enough today. I give thanks for bread enough today. The ledger of gratitude continued page after page, filling what should have been financial record with memory of joy. It became a chronicle of the convent not in gold or grain, but in kindness, beauty, and resilience. Even hardships were written into it, but turned into thanks. I give thanks for our hunger, that it teaches us to share. I give thanks for the silence after sorrow, for it lets us hear God more clearly. Why did she do it? Perhaps because ledgers were taken seriously. They were kept, preserved, respected. By writing her gratitude there, she ensured it would survive, hidden in plain sight among numbers. No bishop would demand its destruction, for it looked like an account book. And so her gratitude endured, untouched, waiting centuries to be read. Imagine her at her desk, evening light fading, candle guttering low. Her sisters sleep. She writes quietly, her hand steady. She knows she may not be remembered for her leadership, her sermons, her wisdom, but perhaps she can leave this, a testimony that life, even in hardship, held beauty worth naming. She closes the book, sets it with the others, and lets it disappear into shelves. Centuries later, when opened again, her voice returns. The abbess who gave thanks daily, who turned even sorrow into blessing, speaks once more. She reminds us that gratitude is not small. It is strength. It is survival. And though her name is lost, her practice remains. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine her ledger. Imagine each line like a prayer rising through time. Perhaps you too can write a line in her book. I give thanks for the memory of those who refuse to be erased. In a convent in Italy, there was once a small chamber, little more than a closet. Its walls were bare, its floor cold stone. Yet, in records written by the sisters, it was called the Room of Infinite Possibility. No one outside the community knew of it. No bishop inspected it, no visitor entered. It was their secret place. Each evening, one sister at a time was permitted to sit there. No tasks, no orders, no rules, only silence. The others would guard the door, ensuring she was undisturbed. In that quiet, women who spent their lives bound by obedience could breathe in freedom. They prayed if they wished. They dreamed if they wished. Some wrote in secret, scratching lines of poetry into scraps of parchment. Others simply sat, letting the weight of the world lift from their shoulders. One sister described it in a letter later smuggled out. There, I remembered who I was before I was told what I must be. There, I heard my own voice, soft but steady. There, I met God not as master, but as friend. The room of infinite possibility was not grand. It had no icons, no relics, no decoration. But its emptiness became its power. In a world where every hour was ordered by bells, this room held no clock. In a system where every word was filtered by confessors, this room required no speech. It was freedom in miniature. Eventually, the room was discovered. A visitor asked why it was kept empty. The abbess explained little, but suspicion grew. Within a year, the door was locked, the chamber reassigned for storage. But by then, the sisters had already carried its memory within them. They created small inner rooms, moments of silence they carved even amid rules. Imagine one of them sitting in that chamber. She rests her hands on her lap, breathes deeply, and for the first time all day, no one tells her who to be. She closes her eyes and feels vastness open before her visions, possibilities, hopes. The world calls it an empty closet. She calls it infinity. The chamber itself may no longer exist, but its spirit remains. It teaches that infinite space is not measured in walls, but in freedom to imagine. Tonight, as you rest, close your eyes and create your own room of infinite possibility. Step inside. Sit quietly. Remember who you are when no one tells you otherwise. Signatures matter. They are how history remembers who acted, who ruled, who mattered. In medieval charters, bishops' names appear boldly, signed with elaborate flourishes. Kings' seals pressed deep into wax. Abbots claim authority with strokes wide and proud. But women's names? Often missing, or reduced to initials. Yet sometimes, if you look carefully, you find a different kind of signature. In one archive, a charter bears a strange mark. At first, it looks like nothing, just a small shape, drawn faintly beside the seal of a bishop. But closer inspection reveals it. A tiny sun, rays extending outward, drawn in quick strokes. Not official, not authorized, but deliberate. Beside the bishop's flourish, a sister left her mark. She could not sign her name. She could not attach her seal. But she signed in light. Her sun is modest, almost hidden. Yet it shines brighter than the words around it. She claimed her presence without permission. Other documents show similar marks. A star drawn in a corner, a flower curling beneath Latin text, a candle etched faintly near a margin. They were not mistakes. They were signatures in disguise, ways women affirmed, "I was here." Imagine her sitting as the bishop dictates terms. She copies the words faithfully, obediently. Then, when no one watches, she dips her quill one more time. She sketches the sun, quickly, quietly, then sets the parchment aside. No one notices. The charter passes into the archive. Centuries later, her mark is found. Her sun is not merely ornament. It is defiance. It says, "Even if my name is erased, even if my voice is silenced, I will leave my light." And that light endures. Signatures in ink fade. Seals crack. But her sun still glows on parchment, a silent testimony to her courage. She claimed space where none was given. She shone where darkness closed in. Tonight, as you lie in quiet, think of her Sunday. Think of how she dared to sign with light. And perhaps imagine yourself, too, leaving such a mark, not grand, not official, but true. A signature of light, shining where silence once ruled. At dawn, before the bell rang, the convent courtyard stirred with quiet movement. There were no trumpets, no proclamations, only the shuffle of sandals on stone, the soft swish of habits in the morning air. To an outsider, the sisters' labor looked ordinary. Hauling water, kneading dough, sweeping cloisters. But if you looked long enough, you noticed a pattern. Their work was not random, nor rushed, nor disorderly. It was choreographed, a dance without music. Each gesture led to another. The sister drawing water passed her bucket to the one carrying flour, who in turn handed her load to another tending the oven. The rhythm was fluid, practiced over years. There were no shouted commands, no overseers with lists. Yet every task was done. It was the abbess who set the tone, not by barking orders, but by moving with grace herself, her steady steps becoming the tempo all others followed. This silent choreography was their survival. For in a world that denied them pulpit and platform, their labor became liturgy. Their sweeping was not drudgery, but prayer in motion. Their baking was not only bread, but Eucharist enacted daily. Their rhythms carried meaning deeper than sermons, though no chronicler ever recorded them. Imagine the courtyard as light grows. One sister bends to scrub, her movements timed with the steps of another polishing vessels. They glance at one another, smiling faintly, and the work flows on. No word is spoken, yet each knows her part. The silence is not emptiness, it is fullness, thick with unspoken understanding. The archives never name this labor. They write of domestic duties, reducing it to necessity. But the sisters knew otherwise. They had turned survival into art, duty into devotion. Their days became dances hidden from history, yet alive in every motion. Centuries later, when we try to remember them, we must imagine not just their words, but their bodies moving together in silent choreography. Each gesture was testimony, each step resistance, each task an act of creation. Tonight, as you lie still, think of them moving silent, graceful, unseen. Their choreography continues, even now, in memory's rhythm. Among the scattered remains of convent libraries, one small object recurs: broken quills. Some are snapped clean across the shaft. Others are worn down to stubs, their tips splintered and useless. To most, they are refuse, discarded tools. But when gathered together, they tell a story. One fragment of a chronicle notes a sister reprimanded for writing without authorization. Another record mentions confiscated papers to prevent unsuitable zeal. Somewhere between those lines lies the truth. Women who wrote too much, too boldly, often lost their tools. Their quills were broken, their inkpots spilled, their parchments burned. The act was symbolic as much as practical. To break a quill was to silence a voice. But quills are stubborn things. Many sisters denied new ones, carved replacements from reeds, feathers plucked in kitchens, even sharpened twigs. Some cut their words into wax tablets. Some whispered them to memory, entrusting their writings to the mouths of others. The broken quill became not the end, but the beginning of persistence. Imagine a woman sitting at her desk, head bent low. She has written late into the night, her visions pouring across the page. The confessor finds her work, frowns, and snaps her quill in two. She flinches, but does not yield. That night, she walks to the henhouse, selects a feather, trims it carefully with a knife, and returns to her desk. She writes again. One parchment bears evidence of such resistance. The ink is uneven, blotched in places, as though written with poor tools, yet the words are clear, steady, unbroken. She wrote not with ease, but with determination, her lines jagged yet alive. That parchment survives, a testament stronger than any polished script. The broken quill is not a symbol of defeat. It is a reminder of endurance. Each snapped feather became an invitation to begin again. Each loss of ink became a test of faith. Women who could not sign their names in history signed them in persistence, in words scratched with whatever tools they could find. Tonight, as you imagine sleep, picture that broken quill. Picture it lying on a desk, useless in itself, yet alive in memory. For though the quill broke, the words did not. They carried on, scratched in secret, whispered in silence, pressed into time. The quill breaks. The voice does not. Near the end of a manuscript collection, after pages of sermons and prayers, one final entry appears. It is brief, almost hidden, a single page tucked between bindings. Its Latin is rough, its sentences uneven, yet its meaning is unmistakable. It is a woman's attempt to gather everything she has learned into one vision, an integration, a weaving together. She writes of the night as teacher, of dreams as messengers, of silence as fertile ground. She recalls geometry, song, memory, labor. She does not separate them, but binds them as parts of one truth, that God is not only in cathedrals, nor only in councils, but in all things. She sees the universe as fabric, each thread, whether song or work or word, woven into one whole. Her life, she believes, is part of that fabric. Her voice, though small, belongs. The page ends with a prayer. Not for power, not for praise, but for remembrance. Let my sisters' lives not be forgotten. Let our silence be known as fullness. Let our work be seen as song. Let our erasures shine as light. Then her hand trails off. The manuscript closes. History moves on. No one cited this page. No one recorded her name. But the page survives, fragile yet fierce. It is the last integration. The moment a woman dared to gather her scattered fragments into wholeness. It is not polished theology. It is lived truth. Imagine her as she writes. She is older now, her hand unsteady, her eyes dim. She has seen rules change, voices silenced, names erased. Yet she has also seen songs endure, flowers pressed into pages, quills sharpened anew. She has lived through both loss and persistence. She knows both are part of the same story. So she writes one last time, pouring her life into a single prayer. She signs nothing. She leaves no mark of authorship. She simply closes the book and sets it aside. Centuries later, when the page is found, it feels like a whisper across time. It is not dramatic. It does not shout. But it carries everything. It reminds us that the silenced women of the church were never truly erased. They endured in fragments, in songs, in flowers, in ledgers of gratitude, in broken quills, in geometry scrawled in margins. Their lives were scattered. But together, they form a tapestry. The last integration is not hers alone. It is ours too. By remembering, we finish her prayer. By listening, we make her silence known as fullness. By reading, we turn fragments into wholeness again. Tonight, as you rest, think of that page. Think of her hand writing its final lines. Think of her closing the book. Think of her prayer rising. She did not know if anyone would ever read it, but she wrote it anyway. And now, you carry it forward. Her last integration becomes your remembering. Her silence becomes your song. Open a convent register from the 12th or 13th century, and you will see names written in long lists. Sisters admitted, vows taken, professions sealed. They begin boldly enough: Agnes, Beatrice, Hildegard, Clare. Some names appear with notes about their families, their dowries, the villages they came from. But then, as the pages move forward, something happens. The names thin out. At first, entries shorten. Instead of Agnes, daughter of Marcus, one finds only Agnes. Then, later, only a sister. And at the very end, no names at all, only numbers. 3 admitted, 5 deceased, 1 professed. Identity dissolves into arithmetic. This is no accident. Records once kept with care were stripped of detail, as though individuality itself was a danger. Abbesses who once signed with flourish are replaced by the abbess. Communities of women whose names filled pages vanish into anonymity. Their memory, so carefully written in ink, was deliberately unwritten. Why? Some say it was convenience. Clerks too busy to copy names. But look closely. In men's registers of the same years, names flourish still. Priors are listed with detail. Monks with family connections. It is only the women whose names disappear. Their erasure was not chance. It was policy. Imagine a sister kneeling to profess her vows. She speaks her name aloud, clear and steady. Her sisters repeat it, welcoming her into the community. But in the register, the clerk writes only, 1, admitted. Her voice rings in the chapel, but on parchment she is already forgotten. Her life, full of labor and prayer, will not appear again. She becomes, in history's eyes, no one, and yet traces remain. In a psalter margin, one woman scribbles, "This book belongs to Cecilia." In another, faint and nearly erased, appears, "Pray for Juliana." These are not official records, but secret reclamations. They sign their names where no one thought to look. They refuse invisibility. Centuries later, we open these books and see their signatures, fragile but stubborn. Against the tide of erasure, they whisper, "We were here." Their names, once disappeared, return in fragments. Tonight, as you rest, think of them. Think of all the women whose names became numbers, whose lives were reduced to arithmetic. Let your remembering be their restoration. Each forgotten name is carried again when spoken, even softly, even in the silence of your heart. It is tempting to think decisions in convents were always handed down from above, bishops decreeing, priests instructing, abbesses enforcing, and often that was true. But in hidden ways, women created their own councils, their own places of decision. They met not in chapter rooms where every word was recorded, but in kitchens, cloisters, gardens at dusk. The records hint at it, though they never name it. One visitation report complains of private gatherings among sisters, not approved by authority. Another letter scolds an abbess for allowing too much liberty in council. These fragments reveal something long invisible, that women gathered to decide for themselves, shaping their communities quietly, without permission. What did they discuss? Likely the things that mattered most: how to share scarce resources, how to support sisters struggling with illness, how to protect novices from harsh confessors, how to negotiate with townsfolk. These decisions may seem small compared to councils that debated theology, but they mattered more for survival. They were councils of care, leadership woven into daily life. Imagine them in the cloister garden, evening settling, lamps not yet lit. They sit together on the low stone bench, habits brushing the grass. One speaks of a sick child in the village. Another suggests they share herbs from the infirmary. A third warns of the bishop's new decree. They nod. They argue. They decide. No minutes are taken. No seals impressed. But the outcome is real. Medicine given. Bread distributed. Rules softened by compassion. Later, when questioned, they call these meetings casual conversations. But the truth is clear. These were councils hidden, informal, invisible to records but alive in practice. Through them, women led without permission, cared without approval, governed without recognition. Centuries later, we piece their counsels together from faint complaints in men's reports, from unexpected coherence in convent practices. We realize that though erased from official history, their decisions shaped real lives. The hidden council endured because women knew leadership is not always public. Sometimes it is secret, sometimes whispered, sometimes disguised as conversation. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine joining their circle. Imagine the quiet strength of women deciding together, shaping a world beneath the gaze of authority. Their hidden counsel is not gone. It lives on in every quiet act of collective care. Every convent had its garden. Some were for herbs, others for vegetables, some for flowers used in altars. Officially, they were practical spaces, sustaining bodies, supplying medicine, decorating chapels. But for many women, the garden became more. It was a place of freedom, creation, and quiet rebellion. One chronicle notes a bishop's frustration. The sisters spend too much time in their garden, neglecting proper duties. What did he mean? Likely that their garden had become more than a field of work. It had become their sanctuary. Within walls they followed rules, but in the garden, rules softened. They laughed, they told stories, they dreamed. Traces of these gardens appear in the margins of their writings. A sister copies a psalm, then doodles a rose. Another draws vines curling between words of prayer. These are not idle decorations. They are windows to the world they loved, the living earth that gave them solace. Some poems survive, written in secret, comparing God to lavender, to lilies, to rain-nourishing roots. Such metaphors scandalized confessors, who saw them as too earthy, too sensual. But for the sisters, they were truest prayers. Imagine them kneeling in soil, hands dirty, sun warm on their backs. A novice laughs as she finds a worm. An elder points out which herbs heal fever. Bees hum, lavender sways, apples ripen. In that space, they are not invisible, not erased. They are fully alive, co-creators with the earth. The garden becomes their gospel, written not in ink, but in blossoms. Sometimes they used it to resist. When food grew scarce, they planted more than they were told, feeding villagers against orders. When silence weighed heavy, they sang while they worked, voices mingling with birds. Their gardens were acts of survival and defiance. Centuries later, those gardens are gone, swallowed by stone or pavement. But records of seeds purchased, herbs listed, flowers named, remind us they existed. Each line in those accounts is more than inventory. It is testimony that women found life beyond walls. Tonight, as you rest, imagine walking through their garden. Feel the soil under your feet, smell rosemary and thyme, hear laughter carried on wind. The women who tended those gardens are gone, but their earth still breathes. Their gardens remain in memory, blooming where history once tried to plant silence. Relics were power. A fragment of bone, a scrap of cloth, a drop of blood, these objects drew pilgrims. Pilgrims brought offerings, and offerings sustained churches and monasteries. Relics were not just sacred symbols. They were lifelines of authority and survival. And in the heart of one convent, a relic became both gift and curse. The story begins with a small casket, no larger than a book, carried to the abbess by a grateful family. Inside lay a bone wrapped in silk, said to be from a virgin martyr. The abbess received it with reverence, placing it in the convent chapel. The sisters gathered each evening, singing hymns in its honor. Soon, word spread. Villagers came to pray, believing miracles might be near. For the first time, the convent drew attention not for obedience, but for wonder. Then the dispute began. The local priest claimed relics were not for women to guard. He demanded it be moved to the parish church, where men could oversee it properly. The abbess resisted, arguing the relic had been entrusted to her community. She produced letters from the family, proof of their intent. But still the priest pressed, warning that women's visions could not be trusted. The conflict escalated. The bishop was summoned. Reports were written, preserved still in archives. One notes that the sisters grow overzealous in devotion to the bone. Another dismisses their prayers as improper fervor. Finally, judgment came. The relic was to be removed. One morning, guards arrived, carried the casket from the chapel, and placed it in the parish. The sisters were ordered to remain silent. Yet silence does not erase memory. For years afterward, they marked the relic's feast day with special songs, even without the bone. They spoke of it as theirs, even when told otherwise. Some whispered that a fragment had been hidden, a tiny splinter left behind in the chapel's corner. Imagine them that night, after the relic was taken. They kneel in the empty chapel, voices low, hearts aching. The casket is gone, but the prayers remain. The abbess rises, speaks softly. They may take what is ours, but they cannot take what we remember. And so they remember, carrying the relic not in stone or silk, but in their shared devotion. Centuries later, records mention the relic in the parish church, but with puzzlement, pilgrims stopped coming. Miracles ceased. The bone sat in silence, stripped of the voices that had given it power. Meanwhile, in convent chronicles, faint notes of its memory linger, proof that the sacred does not always reside in objects, but in the women who loved them. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think of that relic. Think of how power sought to take it away, how silence was forced, yet devotion endured. The disputed relic teaches us that holiness cannot be owned. It is not in bones alone. It is in memory, in song, in the faith of those who refuse to forget. In convent life, light was measured carefully. Candles were rationed, used sparingly, their wax expensive and precious. Each flame was counted, each wick recorded. And yet, in one convent's inventory, a curious note appears. A candle missing, returned the next day. The words are simple, but behind them lies a story. The sisters knew the rules. Candles were for chapel, not for cells, not for private use. Night belonged to silence and darkness. But one among them, her name lost, broke the rule. She took a candle to her room, shielded its flame, and wrote into the night. What she wrote, we do not know. Perhaps prayers, perhaps letters, perhaps visions forbidden. But by morning, the candle was gone from its place, melted shorter than it should be. The sacristan recorded the loss. Yet the next day, another note appears. The candle returned. A sister had confessed. Perhaps quietly, perhaps only by action. She placed a fresh one in its place, hoping no more questions would be asked. Still, the sacristan wrote it down. And so we know of the candle that wandered. Why risk punishment for a single flame? Because light meant possibility. In darkness, thoughts fade, courage shrinks. But in candlelight, the page shines, the hand moves, the voice within finds form. That stolen candle was freedom borrowed, time stolen back from silence. Imagine her in her cell, the flame trembling as she bends over parchment. Around her, all is still. The convent sleeps, only she remains awake, whispering words as she writes. The wax drips, the wick shortens, but her voice grows stronger with each line. When dawn comes, she blows the flame, hides the page, and returns the stub, hoping no one will notice. The record remains, brief and bureaucratic. But behind it we glimpse her, a woman who refused to let darkness bind her, who risked censure for the sake of a single candle, a single night of creation. Centuries later, we read that line in the inventory and smile. For though her words are lost, her flame endures. The candle that wandered tells us this: light cannot be rationed. It finds its way, even into forbidden places. Tonight, as you lie in quiet, imagine that flame. Imagine it flickering against stone, casting shadows of courage across a small room. The candle may have melted long ago, but its light still burns in memory. In the cemetery behind the convent, rows of stones mark the resting places of sisters. Most bear only a first name: Maria, Claire, Agnes. Some have no names at all, just a cross, a date, sometimes not even that. They are unmarked graves, forgotten by time, claimed only by earth. Records show why. When women were silenced in life, they were silenced in death as well. Some, punished for defiance, were buried without ceremony. Others, transferred in exile, died far from their homes, their graves left unmarked by strangers. Some communities simply lacked funds, leaving stones bare. But the effect was the same. Women who gave their lives to prayer, labor, and service vanished without remembrance. And yet, absence can speak. Walk among those stones, and you feel it. The silence is heavy, the air thick with all that is missing. You know there were lives here, voices, songs, laughter, tears. You cannot see their names, but you feel their presence. The unmarked grave becomes not emptiness, but testimony, proof of erasure, and proof of endurance. Imagine one of them. She dies after years of labor, her hands worn, her back bent. Her sisters grieve. But the abbess is ordered not to waste funds on a stone. So they bury her quietly, singing psalms in low voices, tears falling into the soil. No name is carved, no marker is set. But in their hearts, they remember. Each time they pass, they know she lies there. Each prayer whispered in the cemetery includes her. Centuries later, her grave is indistinguishable from earth. But memory lingers. In parish records, her name appears once, faint. In convent lists, she is noted as deceased. In silence, she remains. And when modern visitors walk the cemetery, they pause at those blank spaces, sensing presence beyond what is written. The unmarked grave is not defeat. It is invitation. It calls us to remember those who were not allowed to be remembered, to speak their names if we know them, to honor their silence if we do not, to see absence not as void, but as fullness waiting to be heard. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, think of those unmarked graves. Think of the countless women whose stones were never carved, whose names were never preserved. Let your memory be their marker. Let your heart carve their names in silence. For in remembering, you turn the unmarked into eternal. There was once a convent where silence was strict, silence that cut deeper than stone walls. The sisters were told their voices must rise only in chant approved by the church. No melodies of their own, no words of their choosing. But silence, when pressed too hard, births its own music, and in that convent, a song was born. It began as a whisper. One sister, sweeping in the cloister, hummed softly to herself. The tune was simple, rising and falling like breath. Another heard and joined, her voice threading gently into the first. Before long, the sisters carried the tune into their tasks, kneading bread, stirring pots, mending habits. The melody became a secret companion, a language that needed no words. Then, one evening, as they gathered in the garden at dusk, someone dared to add words. They were not Latin verses, but plain speech. God is here in our hands. The others joined, adding lines of their own, weaving a song from fragments of their lives. It spoke of soil, of bread, of laughter, of sorrow. It was their gospel, carried not in books but in breath. Word spread quickly. Confessors heard whispers of this song, and suspicion grew. Women singing their own words was dangerous, perhaps heresy. They were commanded to stop. The song was forbidden. But songs once born cannot be killed. They carried it quietly, humming under their breath at night, teaching novices in whispers. Sometimes they sang it in dreams, waking with its tune still on their lips. They never wrote it down, fearing discovery. Instead, they remembered it in their bodies, in the rhythm of their work, in the beating of their hearts. Centuries later, a fragment surfaced. In the margin of a psalter, one line scribbled in tiny letters, "God is here, in our hands." That was all, but it was enough to know the song lived once, and perhaps still does. Imagine them that night in the garden, voices blending under the stars. They sing softly, so the walls will not hear, but strong enough that their souls are lifted. The song is not grand, not complex. It is simple truth, holiness in their lives, presence in their touch, divinity in their daily labor. The forbidden song teaches us that silenced voices always find melody, that music made in secret carries farther than edicts shouted from pulpits, that what is forbidden is often most holy. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine hearing that song, soft, steady, still rising through centuries. You may not know the tune, but you know its truth. It sings in you still. In the corner of an archive lies a packet of parchment, bound with faded thread, sealed with wax. Its edges are worn, its pages unopened. A note attached reads, "To be read only with permission." For centuries, no one touched it. When finally opened, it revealed something unexpected. The voice of a woman speaking directly, not filtered, not corrected, not erased. She had written to Rome. Her words were bold, urgent, filled with grief. She described injustice in her convent, sisters punished unfairly, voices stifled, lives broken. She begged for change, pleaded for compassion. She named names, described abuses, told truths no one wanted heard. The letter was received. Officials read it, noted its contents, and sealed it away. No reply was sent, no change came. The seal was meant to bury her words, to keep them from stirring trouble. Yet the seal preserved them too. Centuries later, her letter survives, while the men who silenced her are forgotten. Her handwriting is sharp, unflinching. She does not soften her words. She writes as one who knows she may be punished, but who cannot remain silent. "We are daughters of God," she declares. "We are not slaves." Her voice rises from the parchment like fire, even after centuries. Imagine her sitting in her cell, quill shaking as she writes. She knows each stroke could cost her everything. She dips the pen again, presses harder, refuses to yield. She seals the letter with trembling hands, entrusts it to a messenger, and waits. She never hears back. She may never know her words survived. But they did. The sealed letter reminds us that truth can be delayed, but not destroyed. Silenced in her time, her voice reaches ours. Her courage leaps across centuries, calling us to listen where others refused. Tonight, think of her as you close your eyes. Think of the weight she carried, the danger she faced, the hope she clung to. Her sealed letter is open now, her words alive again. She speaks still, if we dare to hear. Every convent had its stories of visions, angels appearing, saints speaking, lights shining in the night. Most of these were carefully recorded, edited, approved, shaped to fit doctrine. But among them, now and then, appears a vision unfit for control. One such vision comes from a sister whose name is lost, known only as the Dreamer. She wrote of a night when she awoke to find her cell filled with light. It was not candlelight, not moonlight. It seemed to rise from within her, filling the room with warmth. In that light, she saw women sisters from her own convent, but also women from ages past and ages yet to come. They stood beside her, around her, beyond her. They were silent, but their presence spoke louder than words. She felt herself part of a vast lineage, an endless communion of women bound by faith, struggle, and love. She described reaching out her hand, and another hand met it strong, calloused, warm. She did not know whose it was, but she felt strength flow through her. "We are not alone," she wrote. "We are never alone. We are many, even when we seem few." Her vision troubled the confessors. It was too bold, too communal. It suggested authority shared among women. Holiness passed not through hierarchy but through presence. They dismissed it as imagination, a trick of exhaustion. Her writing was hidden, labeled, "of little use." Yet the vision endured. Copies of her words appear in scattered manuscripts, sometimes altered, but always carrying the same truth. A community beyond time. Women joined together. their voices never lost. Imagine her that night, bathed in light, her heart trembling but full. She sees not only herself but all who came before and all who will come after. She realizes her struggle is not hers alone. She is part of something vast, eternal, unbroken. The Midnight Vision remains one of the most haunting records. It tells us that silence is never final, that women erased in one age rise again in another, that their hands reach for ours, offering strength. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine that vision. Imagine light filling your room. Imagine hands reaching for yours. Imagine voices unspoken but strong. You are not alone. You are never alone. The women of the past stand beside you, their silence now turned into song. In one convent, far from city walls, the most treasured text was not a psalter or a missal, but a tapestry. It hung behind the altar for centuries, faded by incense and smoke, unnoticed by most who prayed there. When it was finally removed during renovations, scholars unrolled it and found not only images, but words stitched into the fabric, tiny, careful letters hidden among vines and flowers. It was a testament in thread. The weaver had been a sister, unnamed in official records. She had been tasked with adorning the chapel, given wool, dyes, and needle. But she did more than decorate. She stitched her own voice. In curling letters along the border, she wrote lines of prayer, not borrowed from psalms, but her own. God is within the hands that labor. The earth is holy beneath our feet. We are more than shadows. At first glance, these looked like ornament. Only when someone leaned close did the letters reveal themselves. She had hidden them deliberately, embedding her testament where no censor would notice. Each flower carried a word, each vine a phrase. Together they formed a secret gospel, stitched into fabric where it could endure. The tapestry's images were no less daring. Women appear prominently, not passive, but strong. One holds a book, another a key, another a torch. Angels kneel before them, not the other way around. To those who did not look carefully, these were simply saints. But to those who studied, they revealed her vision, a world where women bore light and wisdom openly. Imagine her in the weaving room, shuttle moving back and forth, thread tightening across the loom. Others watch, seeing only a sister at work. But she knows every thread is a sentence, every pattern a declaration. She whispers prayers as she pulls the yarn, her voice weaving into fabric. Days stretch into months, months into years. Slowly, her testament grows. When the tapestry was hung, no one noticed. The priests saw decoration, the sisters saw beauty, but she knew the truth. Her words had entered the sacred space, present at every mass, every prayer, every hymn, hidden but alive. Centuries later, when the fabric was taken down, her testament was uncovered. Scholars puzzled, debated, dismissed, but those who read with care understood. The weaver had left her gospel in thread. Her testament survived, not because she shouted, but because she stitched. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, imagine that tapestry. Imagine leaning close, reading words hidden in vines. Imagine the weaver's quiet smile, knowing her voice had entered the altar itself. Her testament is still here, written not in ink, but in thread. In convent infirmaries, women learned arts that official records rarely acknowledged. They brewed teas, mixed salves, treated wounds, eased childbirth. Their knowledge came from gardens, from generations, from listening to bodies. But in a world that distrusted women's wisdom, they hid their skills under obedience. One sister, known only as the infirmerer, left behind a small notebook. On its surface it looked harmless. Lists of herbs, notes on weather, prayers for the sick. But woven among them were remedies too detailed, too precise, to be mere curiosity. She knew which leaves reduced fever, which roots eased pain, which seeds quickened labor. She recorded them in coded language, calling nettle the stinging saint, chamomile the golden prayer. To those outside, it seemed metaphor. To those inside, it was instruction. Her healing drew suspicion. When villagers improved too quickly, priests asked questions. When women sought her help in childbirth, whispers spread of forbidden arts. The line between medicine and witchcraft was thin, and she walked it daily. To protect herself, she wrote prayers alongside every recipe. Say Ave Maria while grinding root. Light candle of Street Anne as you stir. Her remedies were never naked science. They were clothed in devotion, making it harder to condemn her. Imagine her at night, candle low, crushing leaves with mortar and pestle. A sister coughs in the next room. She mixes herbs, adds honey, stirs slowly. She prays aloud as she works. But her mind remembers the exact proportions, the years of practice. She brings the cup, sets it gently to lips, and watches life return. Her notebook survived by accident, bound into a larger book of Psalms. Centuries later, readers open it and find her coded wisdom. Some dismiss it as superstition. Others recognize it as medicine disguised. She was a healer, hiding her knowledge in metaphors to escape suspicion, yet keeping it alive for those who needed it most. The hidden healer reminds us that wisdom survives in disguise, that women carried sciences through centuries by weaving them into prayer, that healing was not magic, not rebellion, but care born of love. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, think of her mixing herbs, whispering prayers, carrying both danger and compassion in her hands. Her healing endures, not in fame, but in lives saved, in pain eased, in hope restored. Some women dreamed visions so powerful they could not be ignored. Yet the church, wary of female prophecy, demanded those visions be filtered, edited, reshaped to fit doctrine. Many were silenced outright. But one visionary, cloistered in a small convent, found a way to keep her visions alive. She wrote them herself. Normally, confessors recorded women's visions, controlling the narrative. But she took quill in hand, filling pages with her own words. She described Christ not as judge but as friend. She saw Mary not only as mother but as teacher. She spoke of angels not descending from heaven but rising from kitchens and gardens. Her visions blurred the sacred and the ordinary, placing holiness in daily life. Her writings drew suspicion. Priests demanded she submit her texts for correction. She obeyed outwardly, copying altered versions for them. But she kept her originals hidden, buried in the back of a chest. She trusted her sisters to guard them, whispering, "One day, these words will matter." Imagine her in her cell, light pouring through a narrow window. She trembles as the vision comes a sense of warmth, of presence. She sees not choirs of angels but her sisters at work, their hands glowing with light, their faces radiant. She dips her quill, writes furiously, heart racing. She knows others will not accept this, but she cannot deny what she has seen. She writes until her hand aches, then hides the pages. Centuries later, her hidden texts emerge. Scholars marvel at their clarity, their daring. They reveal a theology rooted not in power, but in community, compassion, and presence. She had seen a different kind of church, one where women were not erased but central. The cloistered visionary teaches us that even in silence, visions break through. That truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. That what is hidden for safety may one day rise for freedom. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine her vision. Imagine a church where holiness glows in every hand, where kitchens and gardens shine with divine light. That vision, once hidden, now belongs to you too. In a library in southern Germany, a psalter lies that once belonged to a convent. On its surface, it looks like any other. Thick vellum pages, psalms written in Latin, red and blue initials marking the start of each chant. But between the lines of sacred text, a second hand appears. It is lighter, smaller, angled differently. It does not copy the Latin. It translates it into plain vernacular words, into phrases spoken by women to one another in their daily lives. The Psalter, then, has two voices. The official one, grand and eternal, sanctioned by church and bishop, and the hidden one, practical and tender, whispered in the margins for sisters who struggled with Latin's weight. Here it says, "God hears the cry of the poor." Here it means, you are not alone. These glosses were not meant for theologians. They were meant for novices, for weary hands, for women who wanted the words of God in their own tongues. The discovery startled scholars when the book was studied centuries later. Women were not supposed to translate scripture. That task belonged to men, educated in universities. Yet here, plainly, a sister had dared to do so, line by line, margin by margin. She gave her community the gift of comprehension, even if it had to remain hidden in small letters pressed against the edge of the page. Imagine her at night, the psalter open before her. She reads the words slowly, mouth moving silently, and then dips her quill to add her gloss. Her Latin is good enough to follow. But she knows others stumble. So she translates, not for fame, not for recognition, but for love. She writes small so as not to draw notice, but steady so her sisters may read. She risks much. If discovered, she could be accused of presumption, even heresy. Yet she continues, because comprehension is worth the risk. The Psalter with two voices reveals a truth often erased. Women did not merely receive Scripture, they interpreted it. They made it their own, carrying its meaning into their world of bread baking and child healing, garden tending and vigil keeping. They refused to let sacred words remain locked in a tongue they could not feel. Tonight, as you close your eyes, think of those margins. Think of the second voice, lighter but no less true, whispering meaning into silence. The Psalter teaches us that truth has always had more than one voice, and that the smallest handwriting can sometimes speak the loudest. In the 15th century, a pilgrim's cloak was found in the store of a convent. Sturdy wool, patched in many places, lined with scraps of linen to strengthen worn seams. On its surface, it seemed ordinary, one garment among many donations. But inside, stitched into the lining, was a secret map, not of rivers and mountains, but of prayers. The cloak had belonged to a sister who left her convent on pilgrimage, traveling across Europe to shrines of saints. Such journeys were unusual for women, often forbidden. But she had permission, perhaps granted reluctantly, perhaps concealed as obedience to some other errand. Along the way, she marked her path not in ink but in thread. Each city she visited, each church where she prayed, she stitched a symbol into the cloak's lining. A cross for one cathedral, a rose for a chapel, a star for a roadside shrine. Slowly, her cloak became a record of her journey, hidden against her body as she walked. When she returned, she placed the cloak among the community's garments, never telling the full story. Perhaps she feared censure. Perhaps she simply wanted her memories close. After her death, it remained, folded away, forgotten until rediscovered centuries later. Imagine her walking, sandals worn thin, cloak heavy on her shoulders. Dust clings to the hem, rain soaks its wool. At night she sits by the fire in a stranger's inn, pulling needle and thread from her pouch. Quietly, she adds another stitch to the lining. She feels the memory settle, secure against her heart. Each stitch is a prayer, each mark a testimony. Her cloak was never meant for display. Its map was for her alone, a record written in secret language. Yet in that secrecy, it reveals the truth. Women traveled, prayed, sought holiness beyond their walls. They carried their journeys not in books but in garments, their stories woven into fabric. The pilgrim's cloak teaches us that memory can be worn, carried close to the body, stitched where only the heart can feel it. It reminds us that holiness is not only in places reached, but in the act of walking itself. Tonight, imagine wrapping that cloak around your shoulders. Feel its weight, its warmth, its secret prayers stitched within. You too, carry your journey close, even if the world cannot see it. Not every convent had books. Many were poor, unable to afford the costly labor of scribes or the purchase of volumes. Yet women still learned, still remembered, still carried wisdom. How? They built libraries in their minds. Accounts tell of sisters who memorized entire psalters, not by choice but by necessity. They would sit together as one read aloud, repeating each line until it took root in memory. Slowly, page by page, they stored texts inside themselves. Some became living books, known in their communities for carrying a particular gospel or a favorite sermon entirely in their heads. One sister, described in a visitation report, could recite all 4 gospels from memory. Another carried the rule of Benedict in her heart, reciting it to novices when no written copy was available. These women became libraries, walking collections of knowledge, passing texts through generations without parchment or ink. Imagine them at dusk, sitting in the cloister. One begins, "In the beginning was the Word." The others repeat, voices rising together. Again and again they speak, until the words no longer belong to a page but to their very breath. When memory falters, another corrects, guiding gently. The text lives not in vellum but in community. Their mental libraries went beyond scripture. Some memorized recipes, others genealogies, others hymns. Knowledge forbidden to write, perhaps healing practices or local tales, was carried in story, spoken in evenings, kept alive through retelling. Each sister became a shelf, and together they formed a library far larger than their convent walls could hold. Centuries later, when written records fall silent, we glimpse evidence of these living libraries. A chronicler notes a sister reciting without book. A letter marvels at a nun who carried all the psalms in her chest. These hints remind us that wisdom does not vanish for lack of ink. It endures in memory, carried in bodies, spoken in breath. The library in the mind teaches us that knowledge is not fragile parchment but living presence. It survives where ink fades, thrives where pages crumble. The silenced women of the church became librarians of the unseen, holding texts within themselves, refusing erasure even without books. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, imagine walking among such a library, not shelves of paper, but sisters whispering, chanting, reciting. Each one a volume, each one a keeper of memory. The library still lives, for memory once planted never truly dies.